So, Custodes are pretty good. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Tournament Tech Talk. This is the Warhammer 40k show where we pick lists from the previous week worth of large events and GTs and talk about them in excruciating detail. But today's episode is going to be a little bit different because instead of picking an individual list, I'm going to be talking about a faction full of lists. And that's because right now, the metagame is being absolutely dominated by the new Adeptus Custodes Codex. Now, the Adeptus Custodes Codex has hit the ground running to an extent that we haven't seen too much of in 9th edition, winning or podiuming the vast majority of large events since its release a couple weeks ago. And today, what we're going to be talking about is exactly why that's happening, with an overarching review of the strengths of the Adeptus Custodes Codex, as well as a review of some of the lists that have gone undefeated in their events over the past week or so, and as always, some review of the details of those events in question. So without further ado, let's get into it and talk about the Emperor's Golden Boys. So when it comes to discussing the strengths of the Custodes faction, they can really be broken down into three important points. These being objective control, efficient damage output, and spiky defensive profiles. When it comes to controlling objectives, Adeptus Custodes are one of the best factions. To make matters even worse for the rest of the game, the GT 2022 format tends to rely on 5 objective missions where control of the center of the table is paramount, and Adeptus Custodes are going to be one of the best factions for doing that, given that while they have a low model count and they're not the most mobile army in the game, what they can do is concentrate a lot of their power on those particular objectives and use their high defensive profiles and just resilience of their base infantry to hold their outlying flank objectives pretty reliably. That lets them shift their focus to the center of the table, score secondary objectives like Stranglehold very consistently, and basically just bully your opponent out of being able to fight with them on primary objectives. Unfortunately, Custodes' secondary objective scoring isn't particularly great. Their faction-specific secondaries aren't phenomenal, but they're so good at primary objectives that with these new GT 2022 missions, they can usually overcome that secondary objective weakness. This is reinforced by the faction abilities, with everything in their army counting as multiple models for controlling objectives, tons of access to objective secured units with all of their infantry, especially their characters, being objective secured, meaning that getting rid of all of the OBSEC on a particular objective is very difficult, so their opponent is often forced to throw their own chaff units onto those objectives to actually get that objective secured ability active there in order to stop the Custodes from holding it. That's made even tougher though, thanks to wide access to heroic interventions, with everything in the army being able to heroically intervene for 1 CP and characters being able to do it at 6 inches, as well as Trajan Valoris, who is going to be a ubiquitous include in basically every Custodes army, being able to intervene 6 inches by himself. This means that if a Custodes model is either standing on the center of an objective token or is wholly within the range of that objective token if they intervene 6 inches, anything that moves up to contest that objective token, and especially those small infantry units like Imperial Guardsmen, for example, that will be running up to try to prevent Custodes' control of the objective, is eligible to be heroically intervened into. Especially against those light objective holders, their defensive profiles are typically not very good, and the superlative offensive profiles of the Custodes units are typically able to kill enough of them that the Custodes, counting as multiple models, will retain control of the objective from turn to turn. That also brings us to our next point, which is the efficient damage output of the faction. With an immense volume of mid-weight style attacks, that's strength 6, strength 7, strength 8, and 2 damage attacks, at volumes that the game hasn't really seen for a really long time, Custodes can put out an immense amount of damage, especially against armies that don't have a damage reduction effect active. Even if they do, the volume of attacks can still push through that damage reduction, and with good base stats, everything in the army having a 2+ weapon skill, and access to almost full rerolls thanks to effects like the Emperor's Chosen or Shadow Keepers, sub-faction abilities, Emperor's Chosen giving them 1 reroll to hit or wound for each unit that attacks, Shadow Keepers giving them full wound rerolls only against characters, as well as Trajan Valoris' aura to give reroll 1s to hit and wound. A lot of these attacks can be attacking with almost full rerolls. This can be further buffed by effects like the Rendax Kata or Slayer of Nightmares to push their damage even farther. So while especially in a metagame that's dominated by damage-reducing effects like Ramshackle, the Crusher Stampede Army of Renown benefit, or the recently nerfed Artists of the Flesh benefit. The volume of attacks they make is still often able to overcome that, especially with all of their rerolls and additional abilities. If you don't have that damage reduction effect, the unending tide of 2 damage attacks will eventually wear you down, and even if you have good saves, their high AP values are going to be punching through that. Now that's compounded by their very strong defensive profiles, and this has always been the characteristic of the Custodes faction and definitely hasn't changed in their 9th edition codex. With everything in the army having a 2+ save, as well as a 4+ invulnerable save, alongside a lot of abilities to ignore rerolls like Emperor's Auspice, transhuman effects like Arcane Genetic Alchemy, and damage ignore rolls like Trajan's built-in damage ignore or the Emperor's Chosen 4+ roll to ignore mortal wounds, these guys can be very difficult to kill. Now that's not to say that they're invulnerable, and with the removal of their 3+ invulnerable saves basically across the entire faction, they're still going to be taking damage, especially if you have a lot of AP2 or AP3 weaponry, which is definitely going to go up in value after the release of the Custodes Codex. They are going to be forced to take a lot of those saves on those invulnerable saves. That said, this does give them the ability to basically save out of any situation that they're in. And what you'll find is that in a lot of Custodes games, especially against equally skilled players with equally powerful lists, a lot of times the game will just simply come down to how many invulnerable saves the Custodes player can make. If they spike low in their invulnerable saves, their army will die very quickly because it's typically only 20 or so models. However, if they spike up on their invulnerable saves, they're going to be able to tank an enormous amount of damage and swing back to kill whatever is committed into them. Now, obviously, that low model count is a pretty big factor, and while they are good at clearing hordes just with the number of attacks that their units make, alongside their 0-point Misericordias, every model in the faction making 4+ attacks per fight phase, they certainly can be outmaneuvered because their units can't be everywhere on the table at once, and once they've committed to a particular spot on the table, if you're able to reposition and go somewhere else, a lot of times, especially if their faster units like Virtus Praetors have been mitigated, they don't really have the ability to redirect their attacks and move to a different objective. That's definitely one of the reasons that the focus on the center objective in GT 2022 is so important for Adeptus Custodes. So that's an overview of the faction's strengths and generally why they've been winning. And before we move on to talking about some specific lists, what I don't want to do is make this video sound like it's a complaint about the power of Adeptus Custodes. Adeptus Custodes are certainly powerful, and I do expect them to be toned down in an upcoming FAQ or so, but we are still early days from the release of the codex, so I think it's too early to say whether or not they are definitively too powerful for the metagame. Especially with the almost simultaneous release of the Tau Codex, a lot of players repositioned to tech against Tau, typically included tech pieces that aren't necessarily very good against Adeptus Custodes, and Custodes were able to prey on that over the last couple weeks. Custodes also tend to be relatively terrain dependent, and with the focus of a lot of TOs being on more terrain and more standardized terrain, especially using layouts like the US Open layout, those tend to buff Custodes pretty well, with a lot of access to light cover to buff their already impressive armor saves, and a lot of line of sight blocking terrain that they can use as they move up slowly to the center point of the table. I do think that there are some points in the Custodes faction that could be toned down, but I also think that on the spectrum of powerful factions, Adeptus Custodes are certainly not the most abusive one that we've seen in 9th edition, not even close. But speaking of abuse, let's talk about how some of these players have abused this codex into winning GTs. And we'll cover a selection of 3 lists from recent GTs that went undefeated and offer some different looks at archetypes in the army that are doing particularly well. The first one is going to be Trainer Wolf's Adeptus Custodes list from NorCal Open. This is a 28-player GT in Redding, California. Day 1 was streamed over by the Red Bluff Battle Reports YouTube channel, so you can go check them out over there. I'll put a link down in the description, although I don't believe any of the Adeptus Custodes games were streamed. And this is a good example of a pretty classic Adeptus Custodes archetype. This is a single battalion detachment out of the Emperor's Chosen shield host. It's bringing an Imperial Inquisitor who is a psyker. This include is often either to give some psychic defense to the army that doesn't really have it outside of the Sisters of Silence units that can be included in the faction, but their anti-psychic effects are a little bit inconsistent. They only work out to 18 inches, whereas most psychic powers are able to edge out of that range. And if you put your Sisters of Silence units up in the front of your army, they are the easiest units in your army to kill, so they will be killed very quick. So having access to that deny is pretty good, but also it unlocks a lot of your psychic secondaries, and this helps shore up the Custodes' relative weakness on secondaries by giving them access to things like Psychic Interrogation, which I think we'll probably find is going to end up being one of the most powerful secondaries in the GT 2022 format. That's a very easy 12-point score, especially if you can keep your Psyker safe. This is followed up by a Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jet Bike. This guy is a very common include, especially alongside the Tip of the Spear upgrade for him, giving him reroll ones to hit and wound on the turns that he charge. Because the Interceptor Lances on the Dawn Eagle Custodes give them +1 to wound, oftentimes they're going to be hitting on 2s and wounding on 2s or 3s with those melee attacks, so Tip of the Spear gives you almost full rerolls. Alongside the Emperor's Chosen sub-faction ability to get 1 reroll to hit or wound, that means that you can reroll all of your 1s from the Tip of the Spear upgrade. If you roll any 2s, you can reroll 1 of those with the Emperor's Chosen ability, and hopefully the rest of your dice have converted naturally, which gives you a very easy access to full conversion on all of that guy's attacks. We often see this character with the Superior Creation upgrade. He does have 9 wounds, which is very impressive, and Superior Creation gives him a 5+ damage ignore, giving him the equivalent of somewhere around 12 wounds before he actually goes down. Equipping this guy with a Salvo Launcher helps make the greatest use of that Emperor's Chosen reroll, since putting these powerful weapons on as many small units as you can gives you the maximum access to reroll dice over the course of your shooting phase. We also have this guy with Auric Exemplar, which does help him push through hordes a little bit, since he'll gain additional attacks by killing models in the fight phase. That's also followed up by Trajan Valoris, who gives access to that reroll 1s aura like we talked about, alongside additional CP and CP regen. A lot of times, the play pattern that you'll see with a list like this is the Virtus Praetors moving up in a line alongside Trajan Valoris, with Trajan Valoris often advancing up behind them to keep pace with them, and giving them that reroll 1s to hit and wound on their Salvo Launcher attacks. If your opponent has any resilient frontline units that they have at the front of their deployment zone, the Virtus Praetors will be able to put 3 shots with the Salvo Launchers in per unit, hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, which means they should fully convert all of their hit rolls, and then again, rerolling 1s to wound with an Emperor's Chosen reroll means that even if you roll a 1 and a 2, for example, and then your third dice converts naturally, you can reroll the 1 thanks to Trajan Valoris, the 2 thanks to the Emperor's Chosen reroll, and hopefully you will have fully converted all of your Salvo Launcher attacks. Well, only 3 Strength 8 attacks from those Salvo Launchers doesn't sound like a ton. With the volume of rerolls that Emperor's Chosen are able to squeak out of them, you'll actually find that these units are able to convert a ridiculous number of their attacks. And that's not even considering additional effects like the Rendact Kata. This is followed up by 1 Prosecutor Squad to fill out a troops allotment, as well as 2 units of Sagittarium Custodians. The Sagittarium Custodians, again, can make use of that Emperor's Chosen reroll, although they are more of a volume attacker, firing 9 to 12 shots a turn, depending on whether or not they're firing their single profile or both profiles together. But with the Emperor's Chosen ability to stay in 1 phase of Rendax for 2 turns, typically giving them a Gene Rot Might effect on all of their attacks when targeting monsters or vehicles, so their 6s to hit will automatically wound. The volume of attacks from Sagittarium Custodians tends to be pretty good at chipping wounds off armor. Sagittarium Custodians can also make 4 attacks apiece in melee, assuming they're equipped with their Misericordias. With 4 attacks at AP2 hitting on 2s, alongside easy access to rerolls, these guys can be chewing through a lot of objective secured units on those side objectives all by themselves. We also have 2 Contemptor Achilles Dreadnoughts, again, a unit with a pretty functional ranged attack, as well as a bevy of pretty hard hitting melee attacks to make use of those Emperor's Chosen rerolls. A unit of Custodian Wardens, these guys help keep Trajan Valoris alive in the center of the table, alongside being a pretty hard-hitting melee unit themselves, bringing those Strength 8 Castellan axes to the fight, and those 3 units of Virtus Praetors that we talked about earlier. This is a very common list of Adeptus Custodes, and I think we will probably find to be the most common variety of Custodes being played right now. Whether or not it's an Emperor's Chosen or a different subfaction, the 3 units of Virtus Praetors gives the faction a lot of mobility. They are even more mobile in Emperor's Chosen, given they have access to stratagems like Esteemed Amalgam, which lets them switch out their subfaction ability for a different Shield Host's ability for the remainder of the battle round. This is particularly good if you turn them into Solar Watch, which lets them fall back and charge. Alongside the 1 CP stratagem Maneuver and Fire to fire when they fall back, this unit can perform a fallback, both shoot and charge, in the subsequent turn, giving them a ton of movement tricks and a ton of mobility. Alongside their defensive buffs, a lot of times you'll find enemies unable to fully kill a unit of Virtus Praetors when they commit into the center of the table. Usually you'll be left with units of 1 or 2, which not only gives you the maximum efficiency on your Emperor's Chosen rerolls, but also then lets you spend the CP to pull that guy out of melee and start to engage their backline units. A single Virtus Praetor ripping down the backline of an army can be an absolute nightmare, especially if you're relying on backline shooting elements, or you have a lot of small objective secured units in your backline. That guy with 5 attacks hitting on 2s has a pretty good shot of just straight up killing 5 infantry models, so if you have a lot of units of 5 objective secured units, he can just start removing removing those one at a time if he's able to get back there. And all of that also goes for the Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike. This is all protected by the Emperor's Chosen 4+ roll to ignore mortal wounds, so even smites or other mortal wound effects that would normally get around the defensive profiles of those Virtus Praetors are not going to be quite so effective. Although one thing to keep in mind is that when they do use that Esteemed Amalgam to fall back and charge, they do lose the Emperor's Chosen subfaction ability, which means they are susceptible to mortal wounds, just having to fall back on their normal 6+ ignore. Alright, with all that out of the way, we've talked about a lot of the basic information for Emperor's Chosen. Let's talk about a different variety of Adeptus Custodes list using that same subfaction. This is Michael Walsh's list from the Team Battle Brothers GT. This is a 38-player GT in Carthage, North Carolina. Michael elected to take a very similar core to his list, which you'll find across a lot of Adeptus Custodes lists. He has the Prosecutors, 2 units of Sagittarium Custodians, Trajan Valoris, the Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike with an almost identical build, alongside 1 unit of Custodian Wardens and 2 units of Virtus Praetors rather than 3. What's missing here is the Dreadnoughts as well as the 3rd unit of Virtus Praetors, but those are replaced with 3 Caladius Grav Tanks, these each equipped with twin Arachnus Heavy Blaze Cannons. The Arachnus Blaze Cannons are an interesting include. They're a very strange weapon. They have 2 attack profiles, either an 8-shot, Strength 7, AP2, 1 damage attack, or 2 shots at Strength 9, AP4, D3 plus 3 damage attacks that rerolls against vehicles. Similar to the Virtus Praetors, however, these Caladii reinforce that multiple small units style of play for the Emperor's Chosen subfaction. While the Caladii don't get a lot of faction abilities like Marshal Kataz, they do get access to that Emperor's Chosen reroll, which means that each of these Caladius Grav Tanks firing those 2 beam cannon shots are going to be getting 1 reroll to hit or to wound. Especially if you're targeting a vehicle, you're already rerolling your wound rolls, which means that even if you roll a 1 to hit with those 2 attacks, you can reroll that one and then full reroll your wound rolls anyway for those big D3 plus 3 damage. If you're worried about damage reduction effects, which are often able to ignore a lot of the Custodes melee, which are often able to ignore or mitigate the Custodes melee, including more of these D3 plus 3 damage attacks with those rerolls is going to be pretty good. And these units aren't bad at killing hordes either. They can certainly shore up the Virtus Praetors at doing that, being able to fire those 8 Strength 7 shots alongside their twin Lastrum Bolt Cannons, firing an additional 6 Strength 6 shots with a similar profile. A total of 14 attacks out of the Caladius Grav Tanks is nothing to shake a stick at, and while they don't have the same access to rerolls that the core units do, because they won't get rerolls from the characters or Trajan Valoris, being able to use that Emperor's Chosen reroll to the greatest effect is certainly what's making this list as powerful as it is. So we've talked about 2 Emperor's Chosen lists, which is probably going to be the most common subfaction that you see in Adeptus Custodes, but I do want to talk about a little bit of a weirder one. Let's talk about William Lozada's list from the Salt Classic GT. This was a 32-player GT at the Hey Wanna Play game store in Plantation, Florida, and this list is absolutely wild. It is bringing a single battalion detachment out of that Solar Watch battalion. It is bringing a single battalion detachment out of the Solar Watch subfaction. That's being led by Lord Inquisitor Kyria Draxus alongside the Shield Captain and Dawn Eagle Jetbike. This guy with a little bit different of a build. He doesn't get access to that Auric Exemplar Warlord trait. Instead, he's taking the Solar Watch Warlord trait Sally Forth. This allows him to pick a unit within 6 inches and allow it to advance and charge. Other than that, he's very similar, bringing the Castellan's Mark to redeploy units before the game, alongside Superior Creation for the 5+ damage ignore, and Tip of the Spear to reroll his 1s to hit and wound. We also, of course, have Trajan Valoris, but the rest of the list looks very different than the Emperor's Chosen lists we've seen. It starts off with a bang, with a unit of 10 Custodian Guard with Sentinel Blades and Presidium Shields, giving them that 1+ armor save. We also have 2 additional units of Custodian Guards similarly equipped with their sword and shield, alongside 5 Sagittarium Custodians in 1 unit. You can see that now we are not trying to get access to the maximum rerolls from Emperor's Chosen. What we can do is start to stack these models together in large units to make our defensive stratagems more effective. That's followed up by a unit of Custodian Wardens alongside a single Vexillus Praetor with the Vexilla Magnifica, which grants dense cover to all core units within 6 inches of him. That's going to make this list an absolute brick that's going to move up the table and, again, like I talked about before, try to push for that center objective and absolutely dominate it with that big unit of Custodian Guard. That's going to put the equivalent of 20 objective secured models models on an objective, even in that single unit of 10, because they each count as 2 models for controlling objectives. While normally this list would be relatively slow and easy to potentially screen out of objectives, using the Solar Watch abilities to get +1 to advance, as well as that Sally Forth Warlord trait to advance and charge, this unit can be rocketing up the table, especially when under the effect of a martial kata like Caladius, which allows them to roll additional dice when they advance and discard the lowest, as well as shoot as if they remain stationary while advancing. Kyria Draxus is a very cool include as well. We talked about a little bit before that the inclusion of a single Psyker in the list is normally pretty good, both for psychic defense and to unlock that mental interrogation if you really need it, but Kyria also has the ability to target smites on enemy characters, which is very interesting, and she has a fight last effect on a stick, forcing enemies that she charges to fight last upon a successful charge. This is definitely the most different of the Custodes lists that have won over the past week, but certainly I think shows some of the flexibility of the codex. What we haven't talked about today are the Shadow Keepers lists, which oftentimes look very similar, with a lot of sword and shield custodians making up the bulwark of the list, reducing enemy attacks by 1, making them very difficult to kill in melee, although they don't have the same level of reliability or speed that the Solar Watch or Emperor's Chosen list will be giving them. But overall, it does look like Adeptus Custodes is here to stay, and it's time for the metagame to start adapting to deal with them. I think, like I mentioned at the top of the video, taking AP2 or AP3 weapons in a great volume to punch through that big armor save and force them to be taking those invulnerable saves will mean that eventually they'll start failing, and as soon as they start failing invulnerable saves, their army starts falling apart very quickly. Adeptus Custodes, while they are very effective, do not have that many models, and every single one of them that's lost is an immense impact to the army. So if you can find a way to get around their good defensive stats and start removing them that way, that's also super good. If you do have access to very high AP weapons that are also able to get rid of invulnerable saves, that's going to be the perfect counter, since they have basically no defense against that whatsoever, although those are few and far between. I think we're mostly looking at Death X out of Chaos Space Marines and maybe some other stuff, but that's mostly it. Maybe we'll see some Hammerhead Railgun see some play in order to shoot these guys down. If they're not an Emperor's Chosen, and a Hammerhead Railgun has a pretty good shot at killing 2 Custodian Guard with a single shot, which is it's not too bad. It's about a 100-point swing if you're able to convert the attack. Damage reduction effects are also good against them, since the majority of damage in their codex is damage 2, so you'll effectively be taking half damage from most of the units in the army, although that's not a perfect counter, since they still have a volume of attacks that are able to push through that damage reduction effect. I should also mention that on recording this video, Custodes have received their first round of FAQs, and in that, it talked about the Praetorian Plate being counted as a heroic intervention, which means that units that charge can attack it when it goes in. So if you are playing a Praetorian Plate, just keep that in mind if you want to sink into something big and beat sticky, like a unit of Talos or a Hyrule or something like that. You'll just have to be a little bit more cagey when you use your Praetorian Plate character. That said, none of the lists here actually use the Praetorian Plate Captain, which is a little bit interesting, and I wonder if you will be seeing less play with that new FAQ being released. We're still looking down the barrel of a Balance Pass FAQ on Custodes, and I think they'll be in a very interesting place if we sand down some of the rougher edges of the faction's power level. And anyway, that's all I have to say about Adeptus Custodes. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those folks are phenomenal and help me keep the lights on while I talk about 40k. As always, remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.